What's up, guys? I'm Nicole Rios, and I've got opinions. Today, I am very excited to share the show with a new friend of mine. His name is Richard Swank. He is a retired major in the Air Force. He served from 96 to 2007. He has an amazing background in aircraft maintenance, logistics, 8 overseas deployments, including Kosovo, Iraq, Afghanistan. And today we're going to cover topics related to the military, related to some of our current weapons, where we may be headed directionally, and then our crown jewel today, I think, is going to be conversation on Iran. We're going to talk about what potentially could happen there and a little thought experiment on how that could play out under different circumstances. With his background of the area and of our military, I think he's going to be able to provide a really informed opinion on some of these things, and I hope you guys enjoy. So thanks for joining me today. Really appreciate you being here. Anything in your background that you want to expand on, or anything else you think would be interesting to highlight?
Well, thank you for having me. I just a quick correction. I'm not retired. I served
Oh,
for 10 and
sorry.
a half years in the Air Force. I separated in the spring of 2007. Uh, I'd had enough fun being deployed and wanted to have a little bit more normal life. And then I ended up moving to Washington, D.C., which it's not a normal life at
That
all.
was more normal.
So, but yeah, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be on your podcast. Obviously, there's a lot of things going on in the world right now. Most importantly is what's going on with Iran and how that's going to play out. Um, the nuclear talks and everything that Iran has been doing, I think they're very desperate and they have been crippled with what Israel did to them and what we did to them. And I think that it's going to be an interesting next 2 to 3 weeks, and we'll see how this all plays out.
Hmm. What a teaser. Thanks for setting it up. Um, so just broadly, with your background and kind of, the time period that you served in, now that math is mathing properly for me there, was between Clinton and Bush. And I'm just curious, just as background, between those two presidents, did you see a difference in the way that you guys were allowed to, like rules of engagement, for instance, or any real differences in how things were run?
I don't think so. I mean, things were different after 9/11, obviously, but when President Clinton was in office, my deployments were to Operation Southern Watch. We were enforcing the no-fly zone over Iraq, and the rules of engagement were very clear from the president. They got a little the waters got a little muddy when it came to what was called GTF SWAT, Joint Task Force Southwest Asia, the leadership there. When Iraqi aircraft would penetrate the no-fly zone, we wouldn't always shoot at them, and there was, fighter pilots, they like to shoot things, and uh, so we had some issues there, and then, with President Bush, it was pretty much the pedal to the metal.
Game
So
on.
yeah, it was, but no, there was no real difference between the two commanders in chief from my perspective deployed.
It's interesting because I feel like more recent history, we have seen huge swings in behavior. I mean, most notably, I think that when Obama came in, there were a lot of changes as far as rules of engagement, kind of how we ran out of ammunition. There were a lot of other issues that happened that kind of created changes in the way that we were operating. And now even you walk it a couple steps further, and now we look at Hegseth coming in and kind of creating not creating, but almost restoring an ethos to the military that had kind of been lost. And I feel like your time in service was, prior to what I would consider the fall, unfortunately, of our military, or, they definitely took a back seat. And a lot of things kind of changed culturally. And so it's interesting for me to see that, and I'm just curious for you because I'm an outsider, and I'm interested for you. What do you think of Hegseth's attitude, ethos, and like what kind of like his mission seems to be within the armed forces right now?
Well, I think the first off, changing the name of the department to the Department of War was something that it's been discussed for decades. I mean, there's a some version of a common phrase. We haven't won a war since we were the Department of War,
Mm.
and uh, since World War II, and so that's just a welcome change. The warrior ethos. A lot of my friends that they're colonels now, they're retiring in the Air Force, and some of the things that they would send me and say to me about the DEI and focusing on things that just really don't matter. It stunned me. Even I should have gotten used to it, and I never ever did. In the Air Force, the motto is fly, fight, win. And when I was stationed in Korea at Osan Air Base, our the entire motto of everybody on the peninsula is fight tonight. If the North invades, you always have to be ready. And that was first and foremost in everything you did, whether you were a fighter pilot, an infantry officer, working in the finance office, on base, it did not matter. Everybody had a combat role and you had to be ready to do it. And so I really commend the secretary for getting back to basics. And it's challenging. You have a huge bureaucracy in the War Department. I'm going to make that mistake a couple of times. Uh, but you have a huge bureaucracy of civil servants that have spent their entire career in the Pentagon and they don't like change. And one thing that is not discussed a lot, but DEI and the focus on that in the War Department created a lot of jobs, new offices. And so people feel threatened, and it's going to take time. And I think that's behind a lot of the calls for the secretary to resign is that establishment inside the Beltway. They don't like people messing with their lives. Yep.
Yeah.
And it's a nice little gravy train they have going there. And so I really commend the secretary. My personal experience in the armed forces was that nobody really cared about your race or your sex, who you sleep with. They cared about if you could do your job. If you can't pull your weight, that was always a problem.
Right.
And I was in the service. Don't ask, don't tell was the thing. And I mean, we definitely had you know people in my squadron and wings and stuff when we were deployed and stuff. I knew that they were gay and nobody cared. Um, so I, I'm cautiously optimistic. What what I am worried about is that the next administration, if the Democrats win in 28, are they going to try to um, claw back some of these changes and go back to the old ways? So we'll find out, I guess.
Try not to think about that. It's such a scary thought to me, honestly. So as we look at how the warrior ethos comes back, we also have seen how this national security strategy has come out and kind of reoriented our focus towards the Western Hemisphere through, some of our countries that are closer to us, um, instead of being kind of spread across the world. We've also had a little bit of a restructuring of our commands, our geo national commands. So I think that it's been interesting to see those shifts happen. And I'm just curious what your thoughts are on the whole Western Hemisphere focus and how we've kind of reorganized some of our major commands.
Well, I think as far as the national security strategy, obviously that was controversial. It was really the first controversial one, I think, since since they started producing them in 1986. Um, and I think I think the focus on the West is in large part to challenge China, particularly in South America. Um, and so I think it's refreshing and good. I think for a long, long time, the diplomatic class, as I like to call them, um, you know, people respect them, people listen to them, but where has it gotten us? And we've botched wars and foreign policy for almost 75, 80 years. And so I think it's refreshing that I think Cuba might be next in this doctrine. I don't know how, but I think we've tolerated having a communist government 90 miles off our shores for decades.
Very long time.
And yeah, and it would be nice to see change there. But yeah, I think overall the focus on the Western Hemisphere has served us well so far. I think the Panama Canal is going to be a challenge with the Chinese influence there, um, and our focus on it is, I think, what drives a lot of establishment people crazy about it is that the current administration, they don't map things out far in advance. They don't publicly communicate that. And which I think is a good thing. It's good to keep your adversaries guessing. And also, our adversaries, everything's on the table and they actually believe that. In the past, when presidents would say all options are on the table, but there's times you knew, whether it was Obama or Bush or Clinton, like they're not going to do certain military things. When Trump says everything's on the table, I think our adversaries around the world really believe that.
Yeah.
Um, and like I don't think we would ever invade Greenland, but people sure took it seriously when Trump made that reference.
Finland put up some soldiers for that one.
Yeah, they did. They did. So
Well, and so this is like one of those things that it gets me a little frustrated because when we talk about foreign policy, honestly, that's one of those things that when I elect my leader, I trust in their hands. There's not a world where I think I have more information or a better understanding on how to work that situation than the guys with all the information and the knowledge and the connections, right? And so when people get frustrated about, like, say, Venezuela, oh, it came out of nowhere. We woke up and we had, invaded Venezuela. It's like, you guys, really? Like, this would not have been an effective operation if they gave everybody a 24-hour heads up. And sometimes I think that people lose the plot in thinking how actual like logistics and secret operations work, and how much cover just for the sake of safety, right? Like if you want your guys to be able to get in and get out safely, you don't let anybody know what's happening. You do it under the cover of darkness. So when people get like up in arms about like you're like, oh, it wasn't mapped out or they didn't get Congress approval, it's like, look at half the jokers in Congress leak everything they hear to Politico. I mean, the whole world would have known before we even, took off. And that puts American lives at risk. And I think that there's like this entitlement to information since the digital age has kind of taken off because we have access to so much all the time. But we still have to be realistic with the type of information that we're expecting. And I think that sometimes to expect detailed, like long-term plans, I get, but like detailed plans on, special operations or attacks like that, I think is just a little bit unreasonable.
well,
Um,
and to your point about notifying Congress, I enjoy the hypocrisy of it because uh, when President Obama took out bin Laden, that was one of the most closely guarded operations in modern military history. Uh, and we actually violated a pseudo ally's airspace and could have really created an international incident.
Mm,
And nobody was upset, at least publicly, with the administration for doing that. And our operation in Venezuela, uh, he it bothers me when people refer to him as the president of Venezuela, the leader of Venezuela, because he was not. He wasn't recognized by the United States, the European Union as the leader anymore. And the people being critical of the president uh, were calling for Maduro's head in 2019
right. Biden
when
put the
Biden was
original
president.
bounty on his head, right? Like,
Exactly.
give
Yeah,
me
he
a
was
break.
indicted under the Biden administration. So,
Well, I'm happy that we got him out. I also think that, it's an interesting thing to look at a lot of the Central and South American countries flipping towards like right wing, more right wing leadership. A lot of the recent elections have been coming out in more populist leaders, and it just seems like that when we're talking about creating new alliances, with just the last thing to touch on with this national security strategy thing, it really does talk about reordering our priorities and creating more relationships with some of these Central and South American countries so that we can create trade relationships with them, that their countries can stabilize so we can uh, keep down the immigration across our borders from those areas. And it just seems to have a very multidimensional intention, which I
well,
think I think we should do. I think we should look into that.
and I think there's a theme with the document as well, with getting our NATO partners to pay their fair share um, for the defense of the European continent, as well as the Pacific. Our partners in that region are excellent, but um, I think for far too long, the emphasis has been on the United States is going to take care of China in any way, shape, or form. We're going to be there, our presidents. Um, and while we are there, I don't think we should be leading the way. China's in Japan's backyard. China is in Australia's backyard. South Korea. I think I don't want to get too far ahead, but I think we really, as a nation, should come to some type of we should have a conversation and come to some type of public strategy on how to deal with Taiwan.
Hmm. Do you think that NATO is outdated? Do you think that it could be restructured um, to better protect more realistic allied areas?
I think I think at a minimum, NATO's purpose should be reevaluated. Um, but I think that any organization um, that should be a regular event, um, just like a company. The environment changes, and how do we shift? How do we adapt to different threats? Um, the NATO alliance was very successful um, and served its purpose well in ending the Cold War. Um, since the end of the Cold War, it's grown significantly, and its mission has not changed. And the charter still is the same. And like for the life of me, I never understood why NATO committed so many troops to Afghanistan. I understand Article 5, but and they deployed to the United States like to help with air defense post 9/11. Um, but but what concerns me is when a NATO nation gets involved in something or gets attacked and Article 5 is implemented and there's not a lot of support from the NATO nations to do something,
Right.
because I think NATO's lost so much credibility with Russia invading Ukraine.
Hmm.
Um, and I very much believe in the Powell doctrine, which is uh, General Colin Powell's mantra, if you will, about everything that should happen before we go to war. And one of the his points is that we should have public support in America for the operation. And a lot behind that was his experience in Vietnam. And I'm not so sure that the American public would be on board with defending some of the member countries in NATO. And that's
I think you're absolutely right on that.
yeah, and like what happens if a country that's certainly a NATO country that's involved in a lot of combat operations that's not the United States or England over the years is Turkey. Turkey consistently has attacked the Kurds in Iraq for decades. They have their issues in Syria. Um, and if something happened to Turkey, uh, akin to like a 9/11, I wonder how NATO would treat that. Uh, and
Not to mention, I
it,
just heard the other day that I think it's Germany just had to conscript like 500,000 people, and it ended up being that so many of them were like technically still illegal and had ties to you know, Arab terror states that they were like, you guys, we can't give these people we can't give these people guns. We can't actually get them into our military. Like, hold on a second. And so like I'm not trying to like, put my tinfoil hat on or anything, but in another two generations, one generation with all this migration through a lot of the NATO countries in Europe, are they going to have forces to put up for this? And furthermore, what happens if inter-NATO countries start dueling? Right? Like if you get enough oppositional force in two of those countries and it becomes more of a tribal situation, what happens if our original NATO charter ends up challenging us between two dueling NATO countries? And I'm just thinking all of that through of like what happens then? And I agree with you that it should be something that we are like any treaty that has some type of end date or date that needs to be, reassessed and reconfigured, like a lot of our nuclear deals and things like that. Um, because the world is a changing place, and when you have governments that turn over every few years, like of course for global peace and global stability, these long-term agreements are really, really helpful. But again, we're talking about on what level do we have to reassess?
well, I think you know, to your point, Vice President Vance last year, I believe he was addressing the European Union and discussing the problems that a lot of NATO countries have with immigration and the way their societies look and the censorship and the issues with free speech and social media, which uh, gets down to a very basic point. Do we want to defend nations whose values and ideals are not in alignment with ours? And particularly with our blood and treasure.
Right.
And that is something that I think some European, like for example, Poland is doing a much better job than a lot of their neighbors. And look at Turkey. I don't believe as a nation our values and principles line up with Turkey's very well at this stage. I don't think they have for quite some time. And to your point, to my earlier point, those things need to be reevaluated, and I think they need to be evaluated in a formal way, not just through uh, diplomatic discussions and back channels. I think that a conference um, needs to occur where we address those things, and there's some transparency, not just for Americans, but for all the NATO nations, and um, that is again, NATO is a complex organization, and it by and large has been successful. But um, American support for it and American support for what Article 5 really means, those are real potential challenges.
Yeah, well, and especially with our changing population. All right. Well, so enough on that. Let's talk about some fun stuff. Weapon systems, all of our fun toys. I guess I know that you have a lot of background in aircraft, but I did want to just talk about the shipbuilding situation, because there are lots of stories about the Chinese shipbuilding effort right now, which is definitely surpassing our own. We have been looking, I mean, at Greenland, all of this new information about the Arctic Circle melting and becoming more open for shipping lanes, and also, which means that defense. And when, like as you mentioned, even the Taiwan situation, and being able to have the power. And again, if we're talking Cuba, if we're talking all these areas in Central and South America, like having some carriers around gives us some bases, if you will, to kind of operate from. So what do you think that shipbuilding should be a priority for us?
100%. But we also, you know, the in my opinion, the comparison of the number of ships, which President Reagan made popular, the 600 ship Navy, um, what China is doing with shipbuilding, um, what China says and what China does should always be taken seriously with a healthy grain of salt. Um, so
Sounds like Trump.
yeah, like it's China. China has certainly put a lot of emphasis on shipbuilding and growing their navy, aircraft carriers. Um, but it's one thing to build them; it's another thing to deploy them and operate them in a manner of power projection and force projection. Um, the United States Navy is the greatest logistics operation that mankind's ever seen. Well, all respect to Federal Express and UPS, the Navy to keep a carrier task force anywhere in the world completely supplied with ammunition, fuel for the aircraft, fuel for the escort vessels, food, mail. They do it flawlessly. And we can park a carrier anywhere we want in the world for as long as we choose to do so. Nobody else can do that. China can't sortie a carrier strike group to get to Guam even. And if they did, they wouldn't be there long.
Mm-hmm.
It would not serve any effective ends. So yes, we have a serious shipbuilding problem in America. Um, Huntington Ingalls is the largest shipbuilder, um, and they have Ingalls Shipbuilding and then Newport News Shipbuilding. And Newport News Shipbuilding is primarily focused on aircraft carriers, on making aircraft carriers and doing their well, with the Nimitz class carriers, they're refueling at the midway point of their 50-year life, and they're building the Ford class carriers. Uh, we actually South Korea has a really good shipbuilding industry. Their quality is extremely high, and um, they produce uh, I believe it's an Arleigh Burke class destroyer, but they produce it about in about a third of the time that we do. Um, so it's a real challenge. I also think that the Navy has had problems for years with uh, with their strategic vision. Uh, Things are challenging, but like for example, their biggest recent failure was the Littoral class combat ship, the LCS vessels that have been a complete failure, and we sunk billions of dollars into it, um, and they're not a part of the Navy's future. So I want to see a more cohesive strategy going forward with the Navy. And a big problem too is Congress, because uh, Congress protects their districts, their local and where these ships are built. And it would make a lot of sense to have like South Korea help us build ships, but Congress isn't on board with that.
Well, not to mention, an aircraft carrier, the Ford class aircraft carrier costs over $13 billion. And, a lot of that kind of inflates our own GDP, like we can add a lot of government spending in when we, you know, add one of those, and like you're saying, it keeps the jobs in-house, so to speak. I think that some of the issues become our industrial base has been, hollowed, and accessing the steel and the tradesmen in order to do this can be a challenge for where our economy is at right now. We definitely have gone more the way of service industry than trades. And, you know, being able to turn some of this stuff out, I think that there's this idea that all of these government contractors and developers are getting these contracts and they're actually giving the product back to us. And like, that's not really how things are working out. And we can have contracts for 6 or 7 years. And like Air Force One has been a contract forever. Boeing still hasn't paid up or, given us a plan, right? And so, the recently, or probably a couple months ago now, Trump, was putting out the executive order about, these guys better, or maybe it was a true social. I feel like they're both the same these days. It's like, EO by truth. But I do think that, he's putting pressure on some of these contractors to actually like show up, and, put up. And this idea that maybe looking at building a $13 billion aircraft carrier could be a little bit less effective than trying to do a couple smaller vessels. Or when you look at the way that our strategy is changing, are do you think that going towards these big aircraft carriers and building more of them is necessary? Like, do we have a lot that need to be decommissioned? Or do you think that it would be a good idea to work on some more like mid-sized ships, or ships that we could get more built more quickly, and have something to work with?
Well, I think that the aircraft carrier is going to be relevant. There are those who question its survivability um, in a near peer engagement, specifically with China and hypersonic weapons. But in that scenario, the Pacific's a very, very large body of water,
Yeah.
and an aircraft carrier is very, very, very small in the Pacific Ocean. Um, but certainly the aircraft carrier, like right now, the Lincoln is in the Arabian Sea, and that is putting a ton of pressure on Iran. And uh, we don't need anyone's permission to launch aircraft from an aircraft carrier. Um, uh, and so I believe it'll be relevant for a
Is
long
that part of
time.
its benefits? Is that we can
Huge.
launch off of it
Yes.
based on like law of international waters?
Yeah, we're in international waters and we can do whatever we want. Just like anybody else could, the French or the British or the Chinese, if they want to fly aircraft 15 miles off the coast of a country, launching them and operating in that environment, they can. Um, but the carriers, yeah, they are extremely expensive. I believe, obviously, Ford is the first one of the Ford class. John F. Kennedy is the second, and it just went out on its first sea trials last week. But it's behind schedule and over budget. Um, and the most important ships on the U.S. Navy are submarines.
Mhm.
They what they do. From a deterrent aspect, obviously, but also from intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance. Um, they are by far and away the most valuable. They might be the most valuable weapon in the entire U.S. military.
Mhm.
Um, and they do. I mean, they're called the silent service for a reason. And we're building obviously the Virginia class attack submarines to replace the LA class attack subs, and the Columbia submarine is coming on board, ballistic missile sub to replace the Ohio class subs um, as part of the triad for nuclear deterrence. But the Navy also the Navy's shipbuilding strategy, I've always believed a huge part of the problem is that the communities in the Navy are so competitive with each other. You have the submariners, the surface warfare uh, community, and then you have aviation and the carriers. And you also have the Gator Navy, it's called, the amphibious ships that support the Marine Corps' amphibious mission. And so it's been very kind of like back in the day in the Air Force, the bomber guys versus the fighter guys. And where are we going to spend our money?
Mm.
And uh, in the Navy, the chief of naval operations, it can be, a pilot, it can be a submariner, it can be a surface warfare officer, and they can, in their turn, change the
But
strategy and
spread
exactly.
the
And
pot.
so, yes. And like we're really interested in we're building all these aircraft carriers, but the Navy's equivalent of the F-47, a sixth generation fighter, is called FAXX,
Mm.
which is the program is alive, but it's not being funded to the level the Navy's requested. Uh, and there's a lot of opinions on why. It could be as simple as they're behind in their design and that they don't need as much money as they thought they would need at this point in time.
Right.
Or it could be that somebody in the Department of War doesn't think that the Navy's ever going to need this aircraft because the carriers may not be around for when they finally field it.
Well,
It's
so let me take you up on that point because as I'm thinking about how warfare is going to change and some of the new weapons that are coming out, right? Like we're seeing drone usage way more in especially the Ukraine-Russian war right now. And just AI focused technology. We've got like really interesting stuff coming out about directed energy weapons. We look at what was used in Venezuela, and it was like kind of like a sonar weapon that created a lot of. It was a I forget what my birdie told me, but it works with basically the audio waves, right? And so we have you, technologies are advancing on us. And I just think about like when you think about what the benefit of an aircraft carrier is, it really is the aircraft on the carrier, right? To be able to lift off from there, operate, do missions, do recon, all of these things, right? And you need the size of the carrier for those aircraft to land and take off. Now, if you are switching from even just doing recon missions and stuff to using a drone or an unmanned drone um, to do those missions, you don't need the size of an aircraft carrier anymore to be the landing point for those technologies. And so I guess when I think about the cost that we're putting into a full aircraft carrier, and then you're mentioning, oh, is this aircraft actually gonna, pan out? It's like, man, are they switching these dollars into, a couple smaller ships that they can launch unmanned drones from that you could have 600 drones on a smaller ship, whereas how many aircraft can you get on an aircraft carrier? It might. Plus, you don't need the manning. You don't need a pilot for each aircraft or whatever. You can have one guy that's running a swarm of 100 drones with the same AI, web, basically, right? The hive mind situation. So it's an interesting thing of how do we pivot in tech with technology to kind of help us economically. The Department of War has a big fat budget, and like we're saying, there's still these projects that seem to have push and pull on funding. And what's our direction? Where are we moving for? Biggest bang for the buck. And I just think that, it could be a tactic, right? To look into the smaller ships that you can run some of this technology off of. Um, and I think back, do you remember during around the time of the election, the drone sightings that
over
were
New
all
Jersey.
over Jersey and everywhere else?
Hmm.
And so like there again. a birdie was at a base and saw a drone that kind of looked like something that was getting, put up on a trailer, and now it's all kind of come out like some of that was us, some of this stuff coming off the ocean. And so it's like, man, it's like when you look back and connect the dots, you're like, okay, we're definitely doing this, right? And then you see us using these new technologies, like I said, in Venezuela, and it's like, is the old stuff like, where do you think the split ends up between like our tried and trues and what looks like is up and coming? Because we were at we were at like the special operations trade show. Okay. And the stuff that some of these contractors are coming out with is just wicked. I mean, like mind blowing stuff, you know? And it's so funny to have all of this, all of this really high tech stuff and then look and be like, okay, and we're still with these old aircraft carriers, you know, and how much they're costing us. Not to say that they're not valuable. I think they are valuable. I just think it's an interesting, I can see the future. You know what I mean? It just seems like we're headed and it's a little bit different of a direction from my perspective.
Well, and it's a story that's as old as time. The aircraft carrier was when it was introduced along with aircraft. It was the battleship admirals of the Navy that thought it was ridiculous that aircraft carriers would ever be a viable weapon in naval warfare. Um, General Billy Mitchell, the Army Air Corps at the time, he proved that aircraft could sink ships, and he got court-martialed for it. Um, and it's kind of the third rail right now. It has been for some time in the Navy to bring up or question the the validity of the carrier carrier future. Um, and we build these carriers that they're going to last 50 years. So what is warfare going to look like in 2060? Um, Nobody really knows. So and what the experts say is really um, their opinion, and it could be supported by 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 facts, but nobody really knows. And so the development in technology, and like in 1935, nobody could have envisioned that nuclear weapons and jet bombers that were in existence 20 years later. So I always wondered, like, I think in some ways, some of the technology you described, um, it is almost exponential how it's advancing so quickly. And so yeah, and to drones, drones are a real, they're definitely a force multiplier. I don't think that they're going to take over everything, but also they're extremely threatening to communities and the U.S. Armed Forces. Um, you talk about drones, well, there's underwater um, UUVs. There's, pilots don't want to lose their jobs. Um, and that's a huge part of the issue with drones. I think it's one of the reasons that we were kind of slow and late to the game.
Mm.
Um, and drones served their purpose very well over Afghanistan and Iraq. Like the Predator and the Reaper, those assets could not survive in a like highly contested airspace in a near peer engagement. But these smaller drones that being used in Ukraine, the Ukrainians have developed a lot of really innovative tactics on how to use them for uh, ISR purposes as well as lethal purposes. So yeah, the carriers are going to the Navy's getting ready to have a drone refueling aircraft. Um, and because right now the Navy, the F-18s on the ships, they use them as buddy refueling aircraft, and they eat up a lot of hours on the aircrafts. Um, the life of the aircraft, not doing fighter things.
Right.
So they have to. The Air Force has something called the CCA, the Collaborative Combat Aircraft Program. It's also referred to as the Loyal Wingman Program, where you have combat drones that are larger than, more like the size of like a F-16 that are controlled by another fighter like an F-35 or an F-22, F-15EX, or potentially make it kind of a plug and play where it could be controlled by bomber aircraft, a B-21, and you can send them out to do all different kinds of
Ooh.
missions. And with AI, they can adapt and do things on their own. Go take out this surface air missile site, go over here and be a decoy, go over here and do some electronic warfare. So it's slowly happening, and
That's
yeah,
fancy. That's cool.
yeah, it is. And Ukraine has been an excellent battlefield lab for
Well,
not to make light of the conflict and the um, what's going on there, but Ukraine has really, really been adaptive with how they use drones and operate in an environment where their enemy also is making uh, good use of drones.
right. Well, and some of the things that some people don't understand about drones is that there is a challenge with the fact that a drone is mostly flown by radio control, right? And so there's these challenges with jamming signals and being autonomous and not, there was a period where they were having to fly them from fiber optic, cables to be able to avoid getting jammed or being, hijacked essentially. And so there's obviously a progression where we're having to develop like being able to not, not get jammed, not be co-opted. So I think it'll be interesting to see where that heads. So I was in doing research for this, I came up on the directed energy weapons, because these are when we talk about a drone swarm coming in and using a missile, right, for instance, to shoot down a bunch of drones, it's just not a cost effective solution, right? Um, and and so some of these direct energy weapons have been brought up lately, and in like the Department of War X feed, okay. And I'm like, they're like really like putting it out there, which I feel like these are some of those things that most of the public would. It's one of those things we want to know exists, but we don't necessarily want to know about it. Um, and so the DNI, Tulsi Gabbard, had put together this group at the DNI that was called the DIG, or the Directors Initiative Group, and it was supposed to be going through things within the intelligence community and kind of like coming up with a little bit of a investigation on certain things about weaponry and AHIs, which are anomalous health incidents, right? Which I think all the soldiers from Venezuela probably understand what that means. And so there was a recent report from a DC journalist named Catherine Herridge that came out, and in that report, she writes, as one example, I confirmed through multiple sources that the report and findings into directed energy attacks, or AHIs, were finalized and prepped for release weeks ago. This is through Tulsi Gabbard and that group, that the directors group that was put together. And it says, but there is strong IC resistance to releasing it. And so the intelligence community is like, nah, maybe we should keep that close to the chest. And I feel like this comes back to that whole like keeping your cards close to your chest, not letting everybody know all the juice, right? And I just wonder what your take is on of how much information has been declassified recently, and this push towards transparency, and like where do you feel like the line is when it comes to specifically Department of War stuff where we should have transparency versus like cards close to the chest, especially when it comes to this type of weapon and some of these more, I don't want to call it nefarious, but like, gosh, like we can go and just press a button and then everybody's heads explode and they start bleeding out their eyes, like it seems like a little intense for most of our population, like again, we want to know it exists, but do we really want to know about it? I don't know.
Well, yeah, so I think when it comes to weapons, tactics, and military operations, that transparency is not a good thing. Um, there, except for from a deterrence angle, it's very good that China sees the B-21 bomber having successful flight testing. Um, that's a good thing. We want our enemies to know that there are things that they can reach out and touch them
Yeah, we
should the
got some
need
muscle.
arise. Yeah. Where I like transparency is in strategy, like the national security strategy. I like people. I like the government to explain why something's happening, what our purpose is, what the goals are, what's the exit strategy, um, and you know, historically they haven't been very good at that. I think the last time we actually did something along those lines was probably Desert Storm.
Mm.
We're going to liberate Kuwait. We're going to kick the Iraqis out, and that's it. Um, so, yeah, I do think though, like when it comes to like directed energy weapons, that's that that space is so sensitive, and you, everybody knows that there's research into it, and I don't think it was well known you know, how much of the technology was actually able to be employed
Correct. How far
until
down the road we were on
Venezuela.
that.
Yeah, so that genie's out of the bottle
Yes,
because
sir.
everybody in that was in Caracas that night. I mean, they know what happened. Like they know what happened to their phones and their. I mean, whatever we did was highly effective, and I'm sure it caused some concerns in Beijing and Moscow with how easily their weapon systems were disabled that night. So.
Well, because that's basically, that's what I feel like some people don't miss the idea of is that, you know, China and Russia both had a stake in Venezuela. A lot of the oil was being shipped off to Russia or were in Russian tankers, avoiding all the sanctions. Maduro had his hand in the plot with all these guys. I mean, Maduro's a gangster. So is Xi. So is Putin. They're all the mob just dealings with each other. They tolerate each other, but they use each other too. You know what I mean? I feel like the ethos of that is all very similar, right? And so, like, when we hit Venezuela, we, flexed on Russia and China. Really, that was the point. It was so much less about Maduro, and it was way more about the relationships that Maduro was keeping, you know?
Mhm.
And so I agree. I think that there are some things that we should keep under the covers. But every once in a while a flex doesn't hurt. However, when I look back on the last 6 months, I think that mission to Iran, that was Midnight Hammer, that was a flex. I mean, like the fact that we had that many B2s in the air, first of all together, that they had to be refueled, that it was one shot, out and back. Like the whole thing was just chef's kiss in my opinion, and I have a very close person to me who is a B2 bomber pilot. And I just think like it's just badass. I mean, she is just badass. And it is just there when you were describing like what the aircraft carriers and the power of the Navy, like it just gives me goosebumps, right? There is this aspect of American might that we have to let invigorate us. Like that is, I think there's a level of patriotism that comes from like feeling like, oh yeah, we're badass, we're the best. And I feel like we have to keep that to protect the world. Like who else is coming? Nobody else is coming if it's not us. Okay, guys. So like let's be real. And and so I don't know. I look at that, right? And I look at all of these options on the table, I guess now, right? And like as we turn to Iran and the potential actions, right, that we might take, I think that when you look at now our list, the list of options that have become available or the list of weapons that we could go in and use, it's an interesting thing because the deck gets a little bigger, right? So just as an outline, because I want to start talking about Iran, I know that you have a good interest in this, and a little bit of background. So first, I just want to outline the forces at play because it's a little different than how we understand things in the West or in America. And even I was listening to a interview with JD Vance like a couple days ago. He and Megyn Kelly had sat down and she was asking him about Iran and he was like, it's a really hard thing to negotiate specifically about the nuclear deals, right? Because we just the we're trying to come to new terms. Um, and he's like, you don't actually get to talk to the leader of the country. The person who we would consider as the president isn't actually like the president the way we consider it. It's got like kind of different levels to it. And not to mention, it's like a split between the nation and like an ideological leader, right? So you have like the supreme leader, Ayatollah Khomeini, and he is like the leader of the country. All of his commands kind of go. And then he has the IRCG under him, which is the Islamic Revolutionary Guard, and their job is specifically to protect the regime. So it's not like we would consider our army to protect the country. It's like his personal protection, right? I think about this a lot like Panama and Noriega and the defense guard, because they create the loyalty is not to the country, the loyalty is to the regime, right? And the supreme leader. And so this is one of the things that makes it complicated because the guy we really want to take out has his own security force, basically the size of a small army. And they have ideological uh, ties. It's deep, you know? And so when we think about, okay, well, if we get him out, we are left with them, and how do we predict what their response might be, because of their ideological connection. Then additionally, they have a regular army force called the Artesh, and that's more closely aligned to our traditional military, and they defend the borders. But they also don't have the same connections to the regime, so we might be able to work a little something something there, right? Um, and so and then you've got, just people. The country is made up with a lot of young people right now. The demographics are kind of people who have grown up under this oppressive regime. And like you saw with all of the protests of people coming out and starting to fight against them as they are being weakened, and then them coming out and killing a lot of these protesters, which has kind of created a little bit more urgency, so it seems, for us to take action. And so I guess, so, okay, so I have to say, okay, tinfoil hat, all right. When we look at these protests, when I look back, because again, I can't help but see the similarities between this situation and Noriega and Panama, okay? And the only way that we were able to weaken Noriega's private military was to put information out, to leak information into the public that made people dissent from following Noriega, that started to show him as the dictator he was, that exposed his harshness to people, how he was killing people, how he's manipulating, how he's involved with XYZ leader, basically selling out Panama. Like, it was exposing him as a bad leader and having people turn their hearts away from him that kind of reinforced the push to get him out. And so now I understand it being a younger generation that mostly was participating in the protests, but I also feel like that's the generation that has a VPN. That's the generation that it has the ability to kind of work around some of the restrictions that this regime is holding in place around them. And so it's just like, man, uh, are we naive to think that we may not have been planting little he's and has? Because, one of the main things that the CIA did to get out with Noriega is they set up a guy with a whole bunch of radio equipment. And they started co-opting some of the radio signals and broadcasting little blurbs about, revolution and fighting back or exposing Noriega. And it's like, okay, well, fast forward a bunch of years, we have better technology now, but we can manipulate social media. There are algorithms, there are bots, there are, messaging. And, again, I'm not trying to be too tinfoil hat, but it is in our interest and in the interest of others, not only us, to see this regime fall. Um, and I just wonder, I don't know. What's your take? What do you think? What do you think? Are the
Well,
protests, are they organic?
I I mean that's a great question, and I mean we know uh, just on operations last year that Mossad was operating uh, inside Iran, facilitating some things on the ground to make uh, life a little easier for the Israeli Air Force, um, which essentially took out the air defense system for Iran. They were flying over Iran during the daytime. They had complete control of Iranian airspace. Uh, so yes, I do think that there are things are happening, whether it's with Mossad, the CIA, some combination of the two that are facilitating this. And it might be as simple as just sharing some information with certain people inside the country. Um, it if if the Ayatollah, if the regime was to fall, it's not going to be, in my opinion, it's not going to be through kinetic action only. There will be um, some uh, some intelligence agency involvement to facilitate um, whether he dies or they leave the country. Uh, their support will be the support of the of intelligence agencies will be needed. Um, and I'm to your first point. I think there's two schools of thought on killing the leadership. Are we do we really want to decapitate the leadership of the country because probably the IRGC takes over at a minimum in the short term, and
And is that
the
really less
potential.
chaotic? I don't
Yeah,
know.
is that any different? Like Mark Halperin, he said it the other day uh, that he just said, I just think we should kill them all, take them all out. Like these are bad guys. They have killed a lot of Americans. They have caused chaos in that region of the world for a long, long time. And he's not alone in that school of thought. Um, and I'm of the belief that whatever happens, whatever course of action Israel, the United States decide to take, um, there's going to be some uncertainty after that action is completed. Whether it's taking out IRGC leadership, taking out the Ayatollah, or forcing them out in some way, we can't completely control how it's going to look post whatever action we do. Um, because there's definitely a threat for a very chaotic transition, a civil war. I mean, that's one of my concerns with like arming the population. You're never getting those weapons back.
Yes, sir.
And so it's we certainly are. I think we're probably almost ready. The main thing, we have the assets in place from a military angle to do probably almost anything we want from an air power perspective over Iran. Um, with the Lincoln in theater, and we have a lot of aircraft in Jordan ready to go. The challenge is in getting the air defense systems, the Patriots and the theater, high altitude air defense. There've been a pretty much a nonstop convoy of C-17s from Texas to the Middle East, bringing in additional units, additional batteries, and the necessary support equipment. Uh, to do that. Because if we do something to Iran, it's certainly reasonable that they're going to fire, uh, a healthy salvo of ballistic missiles and cruise missiles at our allies and at our bases that we still have in Iraq and Syria. So we have to be prepared for that.
Well, not to mention that, we're talking about Iran, it's a country, but Iran's ties are, you know, also dangerous, like Hezbollah and the Houthis and the, Shiite militias in Iraq and Syria. I mean, like it's not we think of war with a country as that country within its borders, but the reality of the situation is that there are many other fronts that could become problematic if chaos erupts. And we think about, okay, take this leadership out or take IRCG out, but again, I look back at Venezuela. Okay, well, at least there was someone else to come and step up that we could negotiate with, and we took out Maduro, but there was some semblance maybe that we might be able to put some pressure on. We have some economic controls here, and we're tight roping it a little bit, but the reality of the situation is that we seem to have at least some level of relationship. On this side, there is no relationship. I mean, just today they had a meeting about the nuclear talks, okay? Uh I think it was Witkoff and the foreign ministers for Iran. And, I from BBC, Iran had previously said the talks would be limited to the nuclear program, but the United States, which is demanding that Iran freezes the nuclear program and gets rid of its stockpile of enriched uranium, is saying that now we should also involve Iran's ballistic missiles and their support for some of these other groups like Hezbollah and the Houthis. And so it seems like we're adding a lot of pressure on that negotiation. And so it leads me to believe there's another level of leverage that we have, because it seems like we came to the table with equal expectations about the nuclear program. We were like, here's 10 more desires on top of that. Now let's negotiate. And that's like a heavy-handed walk into a negotiation, right? And so, like I said, like I just foresee, do you think that the leverage there is like, hey, we've got our boot on your throat. Like, can't you watch out? Like, we have all this military pressure on you. You know what's coming if we don't agree. Because, again, we're talking about a foreign minister negotiating on behalf of Ayatollah when that's like an ideological state. And you wonder, like you were saying, with all, with the targeted strikes that Israel did while we were negotiating, the Palestine situation, it was like in somebody's bedroom. Like they knew where that sucker lived, right? They knew he was brushing his teeth, right? And so it's
Hmm.
just like, again, naive to think that there isn't some underlying intel that we already have or, certain people planted. I think that what's been interesting is like people are bringing up the Shah's son. And it has, from my perception, it doesn't seem like he has interest to come back and be a leader to the country. It seems like he wants to support any transition that does happen, but it's not like he's ready to step in and be the Shah again. You know what I mean? Like, and so I guess what's left is an organic candidate rises up, and there is some democratic process that's instilled. I mean, I guess that's the idea, right? Is they can democratically elect their own leadership, and then we don't have to be involved because, again, regime change, historically, regime change in the Arab nations doesn't go well for the United States when we try to meddle and get involved. The difference here, I think, is that Trump understands that he has no interest in trying to make their culture our culture outside of offering a democratic process. And a lot of the foreign conferences he's had where other parties of the Arab states were there, like UAE and Saudi Arabia and Qatar, he made it very clear, you guys should run your own backyard. Like, I don't think that we don't need to be over here telling you guys how to do your business over here, but we would like to be allies and we would like to be on the same page, and with those Arab states becoming more and more secular, wanting to, oil is becoming less important. That's their main money. And as they see that as value dropping, they want to diversify and they want more tourism. And they're all these young princes are building up their cities to be beautiful. And it potentially has the ability to be a beautiful area if people weren't worried about terrorist threats all the time and, flying through certain airspace. And so it is in their best interest to try to maybe be a middleman in negotiations or offer pressure a little bit on certain decisions. And I just wonder what you think about their how having that developing allied relationship with them, and seemingly Trump has a better relationship with all of those princes than prior presidents, or has actually, at least made an effort um, to introduce them to things like the Board of Peace and to have them involved in the 20-point plan with Gaza. I just feel like he has tried to hand them more of the reins. Um, and I just wonder what your perspective on their potential influence or impact could be.
Well, I think that you're absolutely correct that certainly Saudi Arabia uh, it's kind of leading the charge about uh, what the Middle East is going to look like as you know post oil,
Right.
if you will. MBS and Saudi Arabia certainly with just their investment in sports, soccer, Formula One racing, that golf. So
Yep.
um, they're definitely more visionary than they were even 25 years ago. Um, and it's in all their best interests. Jordan, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, UAE, Oman for Iran to uh, not be an agitator in the region. I think a lot of people would take um, in Iran that I mean certainly I think it's foolish to think that Iran's going to be a democracy post if the regime does fall. But even if they're a dictatorship that doesn't um, fund Hezbollah and all these satellite groups throughout the region that are agitators and are a problem for prosperity and peace in the region, I think MBS and a lot of those Middle Eastern nations would take that. And uh, we we really need to, and maybe they already have, again, to our conversation earlier about not they don't show their cards, this administration. Um, and I have no, what, for example, what Secretary of State, Secretary of War think. They may very well think that it's best to just cut the head off and get this over with. One thing that I am very certain about is if I was the foreign minister of Iran or a general senior person in the IRGC, or I was cooking food for the Ayatollah, I wouldn't be sleeping very comfortably. Like I believe we know where they are at all times, and uh, it's hard to be negotiating if you're the foreign minister. You're negotiating with what you know is a target on your back, literally, potentially. So that threat, self-preservation, those are real things. The Ayatollah is an old man. He's not going to live much longer, but there's a lot of people that don't want to die that are in the IRGC and leadership in Iran. And if they have an exit ramp that they can take, um, keep their wealth, uh, and
Their
whether
life.
they stay in Iran or they go somewhere else, uh, you know, that might be an option. You know, I think some people think that the diplomatic talks that are going on right now are kind of a smokescreen. I don't think that's the case. I think that the president and his foreign policy team really believe in exhausting diplomatic channels before taking kinetic action. Um, and a lot of times, diplomacy is not in public.
Right.
Um, and so
Well, and I don't
anything that
also
results,
think that what they're fully reporting on everything that's being talked about and
agreed.
negotiated.
Yes, yes. So anything that gets rid of the Ayatollah, um, you know, him not being there is definitely a good thing. I do think how he is not there matters. So uh, if we can give them an exit ramp and they can maintain some of their dignity, um, who knows? Uh, I think also when it comes to the ballistic missiles and the nuclear, I think that the weapons, it's really the only card they have left as far as any leverage. And quite frankly, their ballistic missiles and their cruise missiles, they don't work that well. I mean, when they did their mass attack last year on Israel, between the U.S. Air Force and the Israeli Air Force, and the U.S. Navy, I believe we had a couple of destroyers in the Eastern Mediterranean. And we took out, I think it was somewhere north of like 98% of the incoming weapons. So attacking them, if they want to expend it, their arsenal and shoot some more, we'll just shoot them down most likely. So uh, you know, the Iranians are very transactional, and they do understand that they will never admit it, but they do understand in private that they don't have a lot of leverage here, and that things are only going to get worse for them. And so I hope that we continue diplomacy with them. Um, I've always been a proponent of it. In Trump's first term, a lot of people thought it was silly just talking to North Korea. And I thought it was worth the try because it's something that no other president's ever done before. And, here we are. We're still in Korea, going on now 75 some odd years almost, and with no real end in sight. And so I hope that we continue negotiating until we get to the point where it's either successful or we walk away.
Do you feel like Iran has any backup? Do you feel like they have any allies that would come to their aid? Outside of some of these like militant group or terrorist group proxies that they have. Do you feel like there are any other countries that would retaliate on us or, say Israel, or, other bases or allies in the region?
I don't think so. I think China and Russia are. Um, Iran is a is a useful idiot for China and Russia, uh, but I don't think they would do anything um, to come to Iran's aid in a time of need.
Yeah, well, Russia's busy. Um,
Yes,
and, I think that China, I don't really feel like China is looking to destabilize things or have any of this happen. And I wonder, um, I feel like they've become a little bit more of a partner with Iran recently than historically. And It is, it is. I think about those three as like the terrorist triad, you know, like you've got like
Yeah.
Russia, Iran, and China over there together, like plotting. And it almost feels like it would, whatever show of force, whether it is diplomatically or militarily, that we show with Iran, I think again puts a little bit more pressure on Putin, showing him what we're willing to do, especially as it looks like he's going to end up getting more and more ground out of Ukraine. And, you know, with Xi to just chill, I mean, like, put him in a corner for a second, because I think that honestly we have way more foreign domestic threats here, you know, domestically, because of the open borders. I mean, just in the last few years, we're finding out all about these Chinese biolabs that we've got set up that are basically harvesting crazy diseases like Ebola and malaria and COVID-19 variations. And so I feel like we have a lot of threats to consider, right? And when you think about politically, right, if we just put on the political lens here and we look at how much of Trump's base kind of came at this from no new wars, right? And kind of like anti-interventionalist, um, that I've heard, and it's in the media, so who knows if they're trying to push a narrative or not, but that a lot of his base are unhappy with some of these dealings that he's doing, foreign policy wise, and how a lot of these actions that he's taken. Uh, and, you know, the old saying, all politics is local. Maybe it's because I have connections to the military and the government that I don't see it that way. And I do see how important, at least Venezuela, at least the Western Hemisphere shift, all of those things I see as completely important to what we need. But I just feel like politically, when it comes to the Middle East, it's kind of, for people in my age range, it's kind of a dirty word because of our perception of 9/11 and the war on terror and all the all of what we understand now to be like a freaking mess. Like the, you know, it just became a mess. And it's like stepping in shit. And I feel like maybe our hand directly on it is not the best political move right now. We're coming into midterms and, you know, could this be something that Israel does with our backup, with our blessing, right? But maybe we don't take the strong hand on this. Maybe we play backup role and let someone else take care of it. Um, what do you think about that? Or do you think like we're better off being like letting it be known what's what and, you know, daddy's home?
Well, it's a really, really interesting question. The military in me says, as long as it gets done, I don't care how it gets done, whatever that objective is. Politically, I think it would be difficult for Israel to take the lead, um, but it's not anything that they haven't experienced already. You know, the Israelis are going to be involved to some extent. If we are the ones that take the lead, Israelis are still going to take heat for it. I don't think that Israel's and Israel's detractors are not going to think, "Oh, Israel's a better nation now that they didn't take the lead." So, um, several reports in the last few days that we basically had to tell Israel no, that they were ready to go, to be patient and let these talks play out a little bit.
Right.
Um, So, but from our perspective, I think that Israel taking the lead is a course of action if we end up using a military option. I think there's also some precedent to support my statement that last year, yes, we took out Iran's nuclear facilities with the E-2 raid, but it was Israeli fighter aircraft that were taking out for 2 weeks, almost 2 weeks, they were taking out all of Iran's air defense systems and operating at will with the ultimate air dominance campaign. And I'm sure we were helping them with intelligence and whatnot. I don't even think we assisted them with like in-flight refueling. The Israelis have a few tankers, and they were taking care of that themselves. Um, but it certainly worked out well for us too. So if I think for America, I think for the president, it would be best if Israel took the lead and uh, took care of this problem. I certainly have the utmost faith in the Israeli Defense Force to to conduct operations and Mossad to conduct operations successfully. Um, so and I think it would also, to your point about the president's base, make life a little easier for him. And one thing we haven't talked about really at all in any public space that I've seen uh, is what would everyone's opinion of Venezuela been in the planning phase? If I was sitting in a room with the principals, one of the things I would have said is this could feel an awful lot like 1980 Iran, like when we had a whole problem trying to rescue the hostages. What happens if we lose a helicopter? Is this like a Black Hawk Down thing? It's so easy to say, like Mark Halpern asked me a few weeks ago, did you support it? I said yes. It's easy to say yes after it's happened
Right,
and it went off flawlessly.
right.
Say the same thing about Midnight Hammer. Although I would have had a lot more confidence. Midnight Hammer, a lot of confidence that was going to be a successful mission. If you would ask me about it beforehand, you have a lot of helicopters going into Venezuela. Helicopters have a lot of moving parts, and bad things happen to helicopters all the time, just from a mechanical standpoint, let alone uh, combat operations. And if we lost some Delta Force, some soldiers in the Venezuela operation and didn't get the guy, that would have been a big you know what for the president and the administration. Uh, so,
Which is
uh,
why I feel like there was so much pressure to bring out like the big guns of the new weapons, because
100%. Yes.
Hegseth's out there with the warrior ethos, and Trump's like, hey, we're gonna make this happen. And the risk was so high, right?
Yes.
That if something went down poorly, it was gonna look really bad. Um,
And
and
that's another tenet of the Powell doctrine is to use overwhelming military force when if you're going to go, don't half-ass it.
go hard,
I,
right?
and you are 100% correct. The whatever the directed energy uh, weapons they used, I mean, it was probably overkill because it's
Right.
not like Venezuela is a very capable army, but still use every tool in the toolbox to make sure that this goes down the way we want it to.
Right. Well, and if not for anything else, to test it on mass grand scale. I mean, how many? I mean, and now again, for those of you sensitive in the audience, this is two people that are, have some exposure to the military. At some level, when you're talking about these things, you have to just cut off the human emotional side and you have to think strategically and you have to war game it. And the reality of the situation is there's not a lot of regular opportunities where you can go and test these things to see how they're effective they're going to be on your adversaries' technologies and protections, not to mention just people, right? And so, like, again, like we've learned so much in Ukraine this was kind of one of those situations where, hey, we've got this new weapon. And I do wonder then, does that go back to the whole Tulsi Gabbard thing about that IC not wanting to release some of the information on these weapons, and there's this push pull, and now we know they were used. And you do wonder with how China loves to steal proprietary technology, or, is it because of those things, or is it because of the population? And do we really want our adversaries knowing the nitty gritty? Because if it's released publicly, it's out there for them to to get a hold of. And so we have I know you are really interested in the whole China Taiwan situation. And so it's like when we look at having to potentially defend Taiwan, or they're kind of like building artificial islands, and China's like building on these
Mhm.
artificial islands and stuff, and it's like, man, we're gonna have to I think that, again, keeping some of our like secret high tech technologies close to the chest, I think, is probably more beneficial than not, as we're trying to, keep them at bay. But when you look at the situation in Taiwan, like, how would you assess that risk?
I I think that I think Taiwan is uh, certainly needs to be defended, um, not just for the principle, um, but also, they're very important to the world economy for a lot of reasons. Um, but I think that there's so much in play here, and I think that it is kind of a paper tiger. I believe, first off, um, you know, invading Taiwan is incredibly complex. A lot of people, there was a CNO and the Navy that like had like a countdown clock to 2027. A lot of people in think tanks in DC and stuff think 2027 is the year that the Chinese are going to invade. Um, Amphibious operations are one of the most difficult things to do in the military. Um, Eisenhower wrote his resignation letter uh, well in advance of the invasion of Europe in case it didn't work. And the United, the United States and its allies had air supremacy. They weren't worried about German U-boats sinking them in the channel. Um, Weather was a challenge, but still, amphibious operations are difficult. Um, and China's going to have to go across whatever it is, 90 some odd miles, and to get a significant amount of troops there and fly across with, theoretically, if we're defending it, a lot of US submarines, advanced US fighter aircraft, um, be very, chances of success are certainly well below 50%. And I think China is looking at it more like a Hong Kong situation, where there will be some type of negotiated settlement, and at least that's their hope. I don't think that Taiwan would agree to it, but I think that's what the PRC is hoping for. Um, China's too reliant on the world for energy and the U.S. consumer economy to start a war
Mm.
over Taiwan. Yes, they are belligerent. There's a lot of huffing and puffing, um, but I just don't see them actually pulling the trigger and starting something like that. And if they were to, the buildup would be lengthy and obvious, and would give whoever wants to help Taiwan plenty of time to position forces, exercise diplomatic channels, um, and project power of what you're asking, of what's coming if you decide to take this action and invade the island. Um,
Well, so
it
what's interesting is, like, I think it was probably within the last 6 weeks they did a massive war game, which they did announce to us. But it was a massive like in the Pacific Ocean situation. And I when I think about stuff like that, it is you wonder when it comes like to the Taiwan situation of like, are they flexing? Is it just a veiled threat? Like, are they really going out there? Because, like you were saying before, yeah, they can build a ship, but can they man them? Do they do they know what they're
Yeah,
doing once they're on
yeah,
them? Was it really just a training exercise? Because they, have a whole bunch of new sailors, and so my mind goes down 10 different rabbit holes, but it is good to hear your perspective on that because this is one of the situations I don't have a lot of background on. I don't really have a developed opinion other than I don't think China should have Taiwan. And I I think that you're right in that I think that China is actually like economically struggling right now. And for them to take that risk and lose our consumer economy and potentially have sanctions put on them by us and our allies and all of these things. I mean, but in honesty, it's a double-edged sword because so many, I mean, our tariff situation is trying to get us away from that, but the rest of our allies are still sucking on the Chinese teat, and they are making all of these agreements and deals with them that are meant to essentially indebt them to China. Unrealistically, like, leases for ports and all types of stuff are ending
right,
back in the Chinese pocket. And so based on debts that can't be paid, right? And
right.
so it's one of those things where we know China plays the long game, right? And it's interesting to hear this 2027, but maybe they plan and then strike at a point of weakness or something, right? Or another scary global pandemic breaks out, right? And they use this as an opportunity to go take Taiwan and have a larger market control over rare earths and batteries and chips and everything else, right? And so when I think about, I don't know. You go back and forth, like what you said in the beginning about taking it very seriously with a large grain of salt. Like, right? You have to look at it in both hands because, you can't really totally believe any of the numbers that they're actually putting out about their economy or their population for that matter and anything else, right? So but at the same time you got to take it seriously because we are finding these biolabs popping up in our country, and we do know that they are like top level espionage artists, and that we do like there is real risk with them, their intention to try and destabilize our country. And I feel like China usually makes choices where it's strike while the iron's hot. Like in when I look back at some of the ways that I feel like they've been able to wield power over us, it has been in a point of our weakness that they have taken advantage of,
Hmm.
right? And so,
Well,
yeah, go ahead.
go, you know, to the point about a grain of salt and stuff too, China has a real problem with corruption in the People's Liberation Army. The PLA, uh, they basically gutted leadership. President Z, I mean, everyone's gone. Um, the last two, I think, were for, well, he said that he was cooperating or selling nuclear secrets to the United
To
States.
us. Yeah, this was like
Yeah,
last week or the week before, right?
right. Yeah, he was like his last. I mean, he that guy was his right hand man. So they have corruption, they have senior leadership problems, but also China does not have, tactically speaking, a lot combat experience. It's kind of like Ukraine and everyone several years ago. We got to give them F-16s. Well, just because you get a Ferrari doesn't make you a race car driver. And having technology, China's building aircraft carriers and modern aircraft to fly off of them. It's taken the U.S. Navy over 100 years to get to where they are with carrier tactics and flying aircraft off ships. And every generation learned from their mistakes. That the old saying, NATOPS, Naval Aviation Training and Operations, is written in blood.
Mm.
That's how they learn all this stuff because they paid for it. And so China building carriers and advanced fighters and stuff, it doesn't mean they're going to know how to employ them quickly. You just don't learn that stuff overnight. And uh, that is that is something where they're a very centralized uh, command and control structure for their armed forces, kind of like the way the Soviet Army used to be,
Yeah.
um, the way we fought the Korean War, Vietnam. The Soviet tactics were very they did not allow for captains of ships, fighter pilots um, to make decisions for themselves. It was, you're going to follow orders, go do this. If it doesn't work, do this, and then come home. Um, and so I don't know how well China would be able to adapt tactically to such a complex and dynamic environment where you're dealing with, you know, the best Air Force in the world, the best Navy in the world, extremely competent partners with Japan and Australia. Probably the British would be involved. Um, and you have in those countries, we train together, fly together, sail together, and China's at it all alone. And you cannot train yourself into experience.
Right.
And so I think China's not as big of a military threat as certainly the military industrial complex wants everyone to believe they are, because China's good for business. I just find it so implausible that they would risk everything for Taiwan.
So, like, let's walk it out 10 years and all of these and AI is integrated into every weapon system and every jet, ship, everything, right? And it can run on its own hive mind. And while I still think that we have, you know, thought we're pretending, right? While we have the manpower and the education and experience that we do to work with the AI to make us that much better, you know, there is this new world opening up where like a lot of these unmanned drones and the even the what is it, the UUPs, underwater unmanned underwater
Vehicles.
submersibles.
Mhm.
um so even those, like, I guess with my fingers crossed, I hope we have a whole bunch of subs around Taiwan just chilling. Just in case, at least getting intel about if there's any Chinese subs over there just chilling. You know what I mean? Like,
Right. Well,
eyes on.
and one thing I always it's always a red flag for me, because my comments about China and Taiwan today, I'm not ruling out that China won't try it. We certainly have to be ready for that option if China were to attack Taiwan. But there are there are so many people in the government who are so certain that it's going to happen, and they don't even want to discuss the possibility of it not happening.
Mhm.
Um, and the war games usually don't end well for the United States. But the war games are only as valid as the information you put into it. Um, and just like Afghanistan and all the generals lying for all the years saying everything was hunky dory and lying to Congress about it, when people are just so certain that Taiwan's going to be attacked and that China's going to be successful unless we do certain things. And what are those certain things? They involve spending a lot of money.
Like, yeah.
And that's what it's all about. And it's unfortunate to say, but I'm always, when it comes to national security, I'm always leery of people who speak with certainty,
Hmm.
because the, it's why the intelligence agencies don't.
Yeah, they've got
They
a
give them
motive.
Yeah, the intelligence agencies are like, there's a 60% chance, and the last time the intelligence agencies were really certain about something, well, that was Iraq in WMD. And how did that turn out? So uh, I I enjoy there's a few voices. Peter Zion's one of them comes to mind. Um, their analysis of China, because I think too many people in inside the Beltway, they look at what the president of China says and their military. They don't look at their economy, what's going on in their society, um, how old their
Population.
society is. Yes,
Yeah,
the
exactly.
demographics, how it's changing, the one child policy and how that's really, now that's coming uh, to bear, and it's really impacting everything. And China, for all of its ability to restrict social media and stuff, the Chinese people are pretty tuned into what's going on in the world. And I'm not so sure how much support there would be for any type of Chinese military operation against Taiwan, or even what they do in the Philippine Sea and harassing the Philippine Coast Guard, Philippine Navy. China, they're they're kind of being a bully at times. And so it's obviously a very dynamic situation. Uh, but I still, if I had to go to Polymarket and make a bet, it would be that they're not going to invade.
We're not gonna do heat. Well, what do you think? What kind of leverage do you think they get with having the threat on the table?
Oh, well, there's a lot there. I think to my earlier point, if a lot of this too, I think our failure in Afghanistan has really, I think it emboldened the Russians to invade Ukraine, and I think it emboldened China to, their current behavior, their tactics, like around flying around our reconnaissance aircraft,
Yep.
uh, the things they do with the Philippine Navy and Coast Guard. And I certainly think that, with Trump being president, they would think twice, like uh, with how aggressive they are at times. Um, but I also think that, President Trump, he everything's on the table, and I think that a threat of invasion might get Taiwan to a negotiating table, because again, we all know that it's China's stated goal to reunite the country and get Taiwan back. There's the obvious difficulties with taking the island militarily, and there's challenges with doing it from a diplomatic perspective as well. But we'll see. But I really think that it's a complex situation where it's not an either or. Um, and like the president, China doesn't, they don't show their hand either. Uh, so again, I don't think they'll blow up their economy and their relationship with the world, um, for Taiwan. The threat of it, though, and Trump is unpredictable. Like, I wouldn't be surprised if they got him to the table to talk about it
Hmm.
at some point in time. And and we all know that the president's averse to war, and
He's a deal maker.
he's a deal maker, and he does not like people dying. And um, Hong Kong is not what it once was, but it's thriving. And uh, I I just think it's again, there's so much that goes into it, and I don't want to pretend that it's not possible. It is, um, but I just don't think it's likely.
Okay. So, all right, we will wrap up. I am curious though on we're gonna do a quick little spitfire round real quick, okay? All
Okay,
right. All right. Odds. All right, it's Friday, right? Today, Friday, February 6th. Okay. Odds that we take action, non-diplomatic action in Iran by next Friday.
80%.
Woo! Okay, I'm pulling the under because I think 30%. I think that I think that the diplomatic negotiations are gonna outlast the next week. We'll see. Although I have heard from people in DC that keep your seatbelt on. So I guess you never really know.
Well, there's some things going on, like just the Um, there's not going to be a moon next weekend. I think it's like a 8% moon on the 13th, and then it's like
Uh-huh.
3% on the 14th.
Uh-huh.
Um, and that window closes, and again, it's not um, well, they prefer to fly on moonless nights. Let's just say
Correct.
that.
Okay,
Yeah.
so let's do the math. That's outside my set. That's right on my 7 day window. All right.
Yeah.
All right. So, all right, we'll see it. We'll have to come back around to assess that after the fact. Anything else you'd like to add?
Oh no, appreciate you having me on, Nicole. I'm a fan of your show, and obviously enjoy your input and our conversations on two-way. And thank you very much for having me on.
This was absolutely awesome. I really appreciate all of your knowledge and expertise and your opinions, and it's been great to be able to get together. This has been a blast. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You have a great weekend.
You too.